I want to say a few things about Islamophobia, which pertain to this book that Claire kindly mentioned, Thinking Through Islamophobia, which came out about 6 years ago now. And it was an edited collection, and one of the things we did in that book was really to try and look at Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. Most of the literature in Islamophobia has tended to be dominated by studies which take the nation state as the main place for where Islamophobia is. So one of the things I wanted to do in that is to try and look at how Islamophobia circulates in different contexts. To support this contention, what I would suggest is that there are many ways of thinking about Islamophobia, and I'm not particularly sure that there's much merit in trying to find the correct meaning of Islamophobia by looking at the correct meaning of the word Islamophobia. This kind of etymological fundamentalism is one of the most pernicious ways in which Islamophobia is not talked about. A lot of ink is spilt, people saying, well, you can't have Islamophobia because Islamophobia means irrational fear. This is not an irrational fear, this is a rational fear, etc., etc., etc. And the difficulty with that is that such an approach is a very kind of rudimentary understanding of the way the language works, for starters. The meaning of words comes from their use, not from their internal coherence or organization or their etymology. So, for example, no one objects to the word xenophobia, which exists in English quite clearly. No one objects to the word homophobia. It's only that they have a problem with Islamophobia. Like, that's a made-up word. And if you say to them, well, name me a word which isn't made up, all words are made up. Words don't exist. Trees and concrete and buildings don't say, call me building, that's my name, I was born a building. All words are made up, so it's nonsense to say that one word is more made up than another. The other thing about it, of course, is that there's an idea, which is similar to the one around anti-Semitism, that if we have the correct meaning of a word, then we will understand things correctly. And the thing is this, words are not labels as much as tools. Islamophobia is there to help us think, help us to do work, not necessarily simply a label that we can use properly or improperly. Okay, so having said that, one of the things I want to suggest is that maybe we should think about Islamophobia as a kind of, to start off with, for me, Islamophobia isn't about irrational hatreds or fears or whatnot, because then you get into another debate about, well, how much fear is useful and whether it's legitimate or not. So what I would suggest is that perhaps the way that I would like to think about Islamophobia is that Islamophobia is about the regulation and disciplining of Muslimness by reference to a Western horizon. In other words, Islamophobia, in all its different manifestations, is really about disciplining Muslimness in relation to what I would call a Western horizon. What I mean by that is not necessarily in relation to the West, though it happens, but it's in relation to the trajectory of the world which is Westernizing. Yeah? So this is why you can find Islamophobia among Sikhs, you can find Islamophobia in China, etc. Because what Islamophobia is there is doing a particular work of problematization of a Muslim presence. To make good this argument, what I would say to you that there are at least 4 theaters where the Muslim presence is organized and configured in slightly different ways, and therefore that gives us 4 theaters around the performance of Islamophobia. Because let me just talk about these 4 theaters, and then I'll come back to the point about the differences in Islamophobia. So the first theater, I would say to you, is Muslimstan. And this is basically countries and societies which are dominated socially or culturally or politically or informally or formally by the Islamicate. For all intents and purposes, you could say that roughly corresponds to the organization of the Islamic countries, and it, give or take, a few members, few anomalies, like, for example, Bosnia is not a member of the OAIC, but Mozambique is, and things like in the Western Sahara isn't, and Ghana is. But generally, it's what most people would call Muslim majority countries. And I don't. So there's one theatre where Islamophobia is performed in societies where the Islamicate is dominant. Now, this is a major break because, again, most studies of Islamophobia tend to be in the second theatre, which is the theatre in which I would call the Western plutocracies. Here, Islamophobia and the Muslim presence is considered to be recent and mainly a product of what the literature calls post-war migration, but what I would prefer to call post-colonial migration. And the reason why I would call it post-colonial is because the idea that the Second World War is some sort of ruptural event and we don't understand why these people suddenly appeared on our doors after the war was over seems to me a complete misunderstanding of history. It is post-colonial because what was the case, the continuity, was between the European colonial empires, which began to collapse after 1945, and the implosion of those empires leading to certain forms of migration. This is not random that most of the people in France are from Maghrebi, are from the ex-Europe, from the French Empire, most of the ones in Britain are from the British Empire, etc., etc. Now, of course, you could say, well, look at Germany. It never had an empire, but again, the relationships between Germany and Turkey proceed before the war, and you can make those kinds of arguments anyway. But the main point is that it is the post-colonial migration rather than the post-war, which I think is important. But the thing in this theatre is that the Muslim presence is now almost totally conflated with the presence of migration or immigrants. So Muslims are immigrants. And the argument is that there were no Muslims until round about 1945. And then they came and made the place messy. So the conflation between Muslims and migrant is total here. So that's the theatre there, okay? The third theatre that I want to talk about is what I would call the theatre in which Islam is almost contemporaneous with the formation of the state. In this theatre, Muslim presence cannot be simply described as being recent or migrate or something that came from migration. Here I'm referring to countries like India, China, Russia, Thailand, Burma, where there's a Muslim minorities which were there before the state was in many cases. The state, the modern state right now, grew up around them. It's, I was talking to Roberto about, where is he there? And he mentioned this line about the, amongst these musicians in Mexico, Chicano musicians, talking about how the border, they never moved, the border came to them. I mean, I can't say it, Roberto can say it properly right now.
We didn't cross the border crossed us.
Okay, so that's the kind of experience. For these Muslims, it was not that they moved. The state moved around them. Yeah? Therefore, it's very, very difficult in those cases to simply mark them out as being external, but at the same time, the very foundation of the state is often based on the exclusion of the Muslim presence in some shape, way, or form. Yeah? You can see that in Russia with the ability to try and dismiss the yoke of Tatar rule, etc. You can see that in different places. You can see that in India, you can see that in Thailand, etc., etc. You can make this up. So in these group of societies and countries, there's a Muslim presence, but it's kind of very ambivalent and very kind of difficult to simply represent as either completely external or something internal. It's on the margins there. And I would include in that sort of communities of Muslims which have been completely erased their Muslimness in a sense through that, and then they've become completely marked out as being part of that. So in this grouping, to what I would call the post-national, the state here, ethnic minorities, Muslim minorities, become minorities through the act of state formation rather than the crossing of borders in a way. Okay? The fourth theater that I want to talk about is really where the Muslim presence is virtual. Now, virtual in English means both, of course, the idea that it's almost not there, but there's also a hint of it being by proxy. And here I would refer to countries like, for example, Angola, large parts of Latin America, Japan, etc., in which there isn't really a narrative of a strong and continuous Muslim presence, but many ideas of the Muslimness or questions around Muslim are inflected through Orientalist literature, are inflected through other kinds of sources there. So in a sense, and this again shouldn't surprise us, one of the largest producers of anti-Semitic literature is Japan, and there are hardly any Jews in Japan. So the absence of having a minority or a group is in itself not a guarantee of anything. In fact, I would, this has been demonstrated again and again, if you are an ethnic minority, the area that you will experience the least form of racism is where there are lots of ethnic minorities, which is in fact contrary to the narrative that racism is caused by too many ethnic minorities being there. In fact, it's the other way around. If you look at incidents of racial violence, they tend to be greater in areas where there are very few ethnic minorities, etc., etc. Okay? But so there's a virtual sphere in which Muslims are not experienced directly. There's no history or sense that there are Muslims, but there's still a narrative of Muslimness, which extends that. Now, in these four spheres, I would say to you, what you then have is a different sense of what a Muslim identity is, and it's performed differently, and there are different investments in it. Therefore, Islamophobia, even when it circulates, it has those particular local contexts. Now, what is important that these theaters are not national theaters. If you notice that I didn't talk about them in relation to specific countries, because one of the things that I would like to suggest to you, that the Muslim subjectivity is a global subjectivity, and therefore these different experiences of Muslimness actually reflect different kind of histories, but they have certain family resemblance to each other. They're not simply completely singular. Islamophobia in France or Islamophobia in the United States are not simply independent, not because there is an Islamophobia industry, but there's an Islamophobia industry which is transnational because they can tap into these different kinds of evocations of Muslimness which are already in play in different ways. One of the things about Islamophobia which makes it circulate so quickly is precisely because there are very few places left where you don't have this kind of entanglement between Muslimness and national constitution. So having said that, and I don't know how long I've got, never worked out how.
You've got 10 more, 12 minutes.
12 minutes? Now I've got to think of something to say. Okay. All right. I'll speak slowly. Okay, so the thing that I wanted to say now is that if you can accept that there are these theaters, and you can accept that Islamophobia is inflected differently, then I would suggest to you, it leads us to conclude, go back to what I was saying, as what exactly is Islamophobia and how we should understand it in the world today. One of the ways of talking about Islamophobia is one of the ways that people have traditionally talked about racism. And that is that racism is considered to be a problem of the interior. What I mean is this, that racism is something that concerns the inside of particular societies. It's not a matter of external relations. If you have ministries which are dealing with that, they tend to be the ministries dealing with interior affairs. Yeah? Because there's an argument that racism is what happens inside the borders of countries. Now, such an understanding of racism completely erases the fact that racism is also part of an international order. And it is only by understanding racism as part of an international order, if you want an order based around white rule or white supremacy, that you can actually do critical work about racism. To make this argument, I want to sort of suggest to you, or ask you, why is it so difficult to get rid of racism? There's a very interesting studies that if you look at and this is more of an illustrative point, look at the situation in Cuba. Cuba for 50 years has had a government which has been dedicated to removing racism. It has actually took this problem seriously in many ways. There are many, many governments which have said they want to remove racism, they want to end racism. But at the same time, when you start looking at it, it continues to persist in many, many different ways. Now, how do you explain the persistence of something that when you can say, now there are two ways you can respond. Once you can say, oh, these governments were not serious. They didn't really want to get it. But this is to confuse cynicism for intelligence. Why assume that they were not serious? Just because you think everything is cynical doesn't mean that it's right, and doesn't mean that you're being intelligent necessarily. So let's take it that there may be, what may be the difficulties of trying to remove racism? One of the challenges I would suggest to you may be to do with the fact that if you continue to understand racism as a form of attitudes and beliefs, you actually miss the real import of racism. That perhaps what you need to do is think of racism as a form of governance. And this is why I talk about white rule, rather than just people saying bad things to each other. Yeah? So it's not that there are people using aggressive language or carrying out microaggressions. It's the fact there is a disproportionate number of people in prison, in death row, in lower education. Those things matter. So when people start talking about reverse racism, then they should be able to point to the situation where you have an overpreponderance of the white population on death row, where you have overpreponderance of white population in prisons, etc., yeah? Outside there. Otherwise, you're not really talking about racism. Now, if you talk about racism as a form of governance, you then have to understand that governance itself is not something which occurs inside states. States exist in larger systems of states. Therefore, in a way, what I'm talking about, that there is a kind of what RAMÓN talks about in various ways, is a racial colonial order. Now, if you accept that argumentation, then I would say to you, Islamophobia has to be understood as part of a global ordering of the world. And what I want to say now is something like this. Why should anyone care about Islamophobia? You could say I should care because it's wrong and I do it as some sort of ethical kind of thing. But I would say to you, there's another reason why one should think about Islamophobia. Islamophobia isn't really about Muslims in one way. Islamophobia is about hollowing out the democratic liberal settlement. And what I mean by that is this. Since 1989, with the end of the Cold War, you could argue that there has been an assault on many of the kind of social reforms which had given this kind of a welfare democratic state system which had been established, at least in the Western plutocracies. Yeah? And it was done differently, but there was some sort of commitment that ordinary people should have some kind of social safety net, some sort of rights which extended beyond the very minimum, etc. Yeah? And of course it's been contested. So part of that was certain kind of economic rights, being able to, one of the ways you could say is that the competition with the Soviet Union in the Cold War was also competition about production. We can have, our workers are happier because they get bigger cars and better dental care, for example. And that was a claim that was made and also enacted upon. It wasn't just, it had to be enacted upon. So you saw the abandonment of many of these sort of social, economic, workers' rights, etc., going in there. What you've seen since in the War on Terror is the hollowing out of what were considered to be sacrosanct liberal rights. Now, the thing is this, that before they disappeared, people thought they would never disappear. But now, many of those liberal rights that were considered to be the hallmark of these societies are already become conditional. I will just point out to one. The question of citizenship. One argument was, well, I'll point out two actually, just because I've got more time, was that citizenship is something which is not simply a gift in a way. And once you were a citizen, you were a citizen. Now you have a situation in Britain, in France, and other parts of Europe where you've had basically two-tier citizenship. There are citizens who are citizens, and there are citizens who can have their citizenship removed even if they don't have any citizenship of anywhere else. Now, think about that for a minute. Once you do that, you have introduced a form of apartheid. And it's not, well, you can say, well, of course, citizenship should be a responsibility and people should act properly. But the point is not the misbehavior of the citizen here. You can be a white serial killer and still be a citizen. You can be a person of color or a Muslim who's driving a taxi near an airport without a license, and you can have your citizenship removed. Right? So this is not a issue about what is not. But now, once you have a situation where you have citizens and not really citizen, you have undermined the very essence of what the kind of narrative was around these Western liberal democratic order. Justice for all citizens. And remember, it was only for citizens. Immigrants, refugees, aliens, etc. were never part of this party. They were never, but the argument was, well, all citizens are equal before the law, and these people are not citizens. But now you have a remolding of what even citizen is. Okay? Now, the thing is with laws and things, once you introduce them, it becomes a little bit easier to start extending them. That's once you break that thing. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk to you about in relation to this transformation is questions to do with being able to critique states and policies, etc. There's always been an argument, well, it doesn't, the reason why these societies are free, because you can say whatever you like within reason, etc., and you can criticize foreign policy, you can criticize the government, etc. But once that has become restricted, then what have you got? You have a form of totalitarianism with consumer durables. Because in the end, what is at stake here is a certain loss of being able to narrate different kinds of alternatives. And you could argue that some of these kinds of issues that have arisen are fundamentally transforming the relationship between citizens and state. And they're doing this in the name of Islamophobia. Because Islamophobia then is not really so much just about the fear of Muslims. As I said to you, it's about regulation and disciplining of Muslimness. But on the back of regulating and disciplining Muslimness, you will regulate and discipline everybody else. So in that sense, the struggle against Islamophobia is actually a struggle for maintaining some kind of democratic rights, however flawed that may be. Because what is being constrained is the ability of citizens in general. Because once you introduce those rules and transformations, they apply to everyone, and they can be made to apply to everyone. The final illustration I will do, because I'm sure I must be running out of time by now, is in the UK, before the various anti-terror legislation came through, there was about 4 or 5 agencies that were able to carry out surveillance on populations. As a result of the various anti-terror legislation, the number of agencies that can carry out has grown to something like about 1,000. Yeah? Now the thing is this, when you have 1,000 agents, not necessarily agents, but people who can carry out surveillance, the work of surveillance will you didn't know there were so many suspects before. Yeah? Partly because you create the own work, but you also have situation that the people who are doing the surveillance are not necessarily properly trained or checked, etc. So you have often cases now emerging that people have been using the surveillance cameras. Britain is the society with more cameras than anywhere else, to basically spy on partners if they know that they think they're committing, having affairs and things like that. Or the local authorities has used cameras to make sure that people are emptying their bins properly. And so sorry? Well, absolutely. And the thing is that, so in a way what you have, and all of this is justified, well, I don't want to be blown up, so I don't mind, I've got nothing to hide. And the notion of being nothing to hide then transformed the notion of privacy itself, and with between Facebook and everything else, that notion collapses in a way. So what I would say to you is this, that the differences in spatial inflections of Islamophobia show that it circulates globally, but it has a family resemblance. But what is at the stake of Islamophobia is not the fate of Muslims as such, but the fate of the world, because what is at stake here is this, that if you take the commitment to the idea that of some sort of human dignity as being central of any kind of political order, what we are seeing before our very eyes is the unraveling of that settlement without even recognizing it. Think for a minute of the rights that you have lost in the last 15 years, everywhere in the so-called advanced capitalist world. Just think about that. For Muslims, Muslims used to say, oh, well, you know, the great thing about Europe and the West is that you can talk about Islam as much as you like, or you can't do that in Muslim countries. Well, you can't do that here anymore either. You have agents of the state, secret police, in mosques, etc., etc. But what is happening with that isn't just because that. But once you do this, there is no, only thing you can talk about is the official narrative. And that means that there is no space left for thinking about differences. But more importantly, you are seeing the erasure of the idea of freedom itself, however problematic and contested, being completely hollowed out without people even realizing it, because it's only affecting Muslims. I said to my class the other day that one of the stunning things about this, and I'll end with this point, is that in Britain in the 1970s, they introduced anti-terror legislation to deal with the IRA, with the situation in Northern Ireland. And that anti-terror legislation was designed that every year Parliament had to renew it. The anti-terror legislation introduced during the War on Terror has no sunset clause. It does not have to be renewed. The only way you can get rid of it is by introducing an act of Parliament. It's not that every year Parliament has to think, can we keep these measures? So what you now have is the normalization of the state of exception. And the normalization of the state of exception means the increase in executive powers, the increase in the paralegal spaces, the judiciary itself. You have lawyers in the United States in prison because they've been accused of supplying information to terrorist suspects. So the idea of the sanctity of the lawyer-client relationship has gone. Everything has gone in face of a national security. And the only thing is that because no one's wearing uniforms when they make this kind of thing, so it doesn't look like it's actually what it is. So what I would say to you is this, that if you see this kind of abandonment going around, then Islamophobia affects geopolitics, not just because it's squeezing out or trying to discipline Muslims, but in that it's building up a machinery of governance which disciplines everyone. How many people go through airports who are not Muslims, but they still have to go through those airport checks and things like that? Never mind if you're a Muslim. Yeah? Okay, thank you very much.